NATO allies have rushed to bolster their eastern flank after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Thousands of troops backed by air and naval support have been sent to protect allies near Russia and Ukraine. Now, NATO does not have troops in Ukraine, but the alliance has beefed up its defense in countries down its eastern flank in the recent weeks. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg has called on Russia to end the war in Ukraine and to withdraw all its forces. Stoltenberg made the comments during a visit to Poland's last airbase. He added that while the alliance would support Ukraine in other ways, it would not send troops or combat jets, as it does not want to become part of the conflict.
NATO is a defensive alliance. We do not seek conflict with Russia. Russia must immediately stop the war, pull out all its forces from Ukraine, and engage in good faith in diplomatic efforts. The world stands with Ukraine in calling for peace.
NATO has for the first time activated its rapid response force. This will add to thousands of troops already sent by allies to eastern members. As the North Atlantic Treaty Organization bolsters its forces and capabilities in Europe, troops from the United States arrived at the Nuremberg International Airport in Germany. In face of mounting international sanctions, Russia continues its invasion of Ukraine. Troops from the 27th Battalion left for Romania. French troops arrived in Romania as NATO is now reinforcing its presence there after Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, in response to the invasion, daily rotations have been carried out by the French Army's Rafales at Frank's Mont-de-Marsan Air Base.
Cette mission, elle s'inscrit pleinement dans la volonté de l'OTAN de défendre le territoire de l'OTAN sur sa façade est et notamment son espace aérien. Et c'est dans ce cadre-là qu'aujourd'hui, 2 pilotes de Mont-de-Marsan vont décoller pour assurer cette défense aérienne de l'espace aérien de l'OTAN sur son flanc est et plus particulièrement en Pologne.
Belgium also prepared to deploy 300 soldiers to Romania as part of NATO's rapid response force. The troops will be under French command and will stay for between 3 to 6 months here. The force is made up of land, air, maritime and special operations. Russia has launched airstrikes against civilian targets. The alliance has faced calls to help impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine, but NATO has rejected that idea, arguing that it could drag the alliance and that could turn into a nuclear conflict with Moscow. NATO foreign ministers will also hold emergency talks in Brussels on Friday over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And for more on this, joining us live from Brussels is our correspondent Rosie Bersha. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, NATO is bolstering its eastern flank. Can you take us through the developments and the deployments and the plan of action here?
Absolutely. Well, we've certainly been reporting on this more since this invasion, but NATO would like to highlight that it has in fact been bolstering its eastern flank for weeks and months. This is a long-term effort. So those are particularly countries in Eastern Europe or in the Baltics that are members of NATO. For example, Poland or Estonia or Romania. We saw yesterday the first ever kind of historic deployment of the NATO response force. Those are led by French troops in Romania, and the idea there really is to assuage the fears of these NATO allies on the alliance's eastern flank. Many of those troops coming from France, from the UK, from the US. Some are stationed bilaterally, some within NATO deployments. Those deployments on the eastern flank are not new. Many of them have been in place particularly since the Russian annexation of Crimea. So that has been some of the movement that NATO has been doing. And of course, this is all about trying to really reassure those allies. But NATO will not be, as you mentioned, sending any troops into Ukraine. Ukraine is not a member of the alliance, so there will be no NATO boots on the ground there.
All right, absolutely. Now, NATO also rejected Ukraine's request for a no-fly zone. What can you tell us about this decision?
Well, this essentially falls into what I just mentioned, that Ukraine is not a member of the alliance. So NATO has a collective defence pledge, which they call Article 5. That means if any member of the alliance, so those 30 members, are threatened, they can expect defensive support from other allies. Because Ukraine is not party to that, and that's essentially why NATO is saying it will not impose this no-fly zone. There are fears that doing so would essentially lead to an all-out world war. Now, this is being criticised by Ukraine. Ukraine says there is already a war, we need help. But NATO allies are very hesitant to do so and say they will not do that. That's particularly would be squaring up with a major nuclear power and could lead to even increased instability and a bigger war. And that's certainly something that allies want to avoid.
All right. All right, Rosie, thank you so much for joining us with all the updates on that. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.